You're listening to the Tudors Dynasty podcast with Rebecca Larson.
Welcome to episode 126. I'm your host, Rebecca. As a 10th century ruler, she is frequently referred to as a warrior queen. This daughter of Alfred the Great appears to have been respected by the people of her time. But was she murdered? On today's episode, historian Annie Whitehead fills in the details of this fascinating woman named Aethelflaed. Annie, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Every once in a while, I want to do something that's a little out of our comfort zone, and today's topic is definitely one of those because we're going to be stepping back in time to the 9th and 10th century, a time period that really is foreign to a bunch of the listeners today. But as always, it is so important to understanding the world that the Tudors later lived in. So our topic today is Aethelflaed. Is that the right way to say her name?
Oh, well, there's a big discussion about that. I think probably the closest pronunciation would be Aethelflaed. But she was later modernized to sort of Aethelflaed and Aethelflaed, so anything's fine. I tend to call her Aethelflaed, but...
All right. Well, I'll just say whatever comes out. It's one of those, maybe one of the first questions I should start with, and hopefully you can answer this for me. Why were there names like that, the AE at the beginning? Is there a history behind that at all?
It's just really part of the Old English language and the Old English alphabet. And they had a few sounds, mainly the diphthongs that we kind of have lost over the years. So they had the AE, which was known as the ash sound. And you find that in names like Aethelflaed. And in fact, Alfred the Great, her father, his name would originally have been spelt with that funny AE diphthong at the beginning. And they had other ones where E and A were combined, but we seem to have lost them over the years. They sort of stayed around in words like the original medieval, the spelling of the word medieval had a little AE in the middle of it. But I think it's just part of the original Old English Germanic language that we've lost over the years.
Interesting. Well, I know a lot of the listeners might recognize her name if they watch The Last Kingdom, which is a series on Netflix. And it's actually one that I got into unexpectedly because I just love history so much. And I remember watching it and falling in love with the history of the time and wanting to understand more of what happened with the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings or the Danes. So let's begin with who exactly were the Anglo-Saxons and why is this time in history so important?
Well, the Anglo-Saxons, it's a bit of a problematic name now, but essentially they came from Europe and they came from Saxony, obviously. So we've got the Saxons. They were also Angles, but they weren't just Angles and Saxons. They were also Jutes and Frisians. Somewhere along the way, it became convenient to group them together as Anglo-Saxons. We have the writings of the likes of Bede to thank for that, but it doesn't give a very clear-cut overview. And we also don't really know how the nature of what happened when they got here. For a long time, it was thought that they just completely obliterated the Britons who were living here. And place name evidence would suggest that because most of the English place names now do originate from either the so-called Anglo-Saxons or Viking names. So it was assumed that the native population, as it were, was just completely destroyed. But the thinking now is that there was possibly a lot more peaceful integration than we might originally have supposed. But essentially, they came across from the likes of Germany and Frisia and settled here one way or the other. And then there was a lot of absorption of the British kingdoms that were already there, either peacefully or not so peacefully. And eventually what happened was that it became several kingdoms. So we had the Kingdom of Northumbria. By Alfred the Great and Aethelflaed's time, there were four main kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. Which wasn't actually called Wessex then. It was just the land of the West Saxons. So obviously we know that people in Wessex were Saxon. The Mercians were probably Angles. It's important because I suppose in a way It's the birth of England rather than Britain. The people who lived there before were the Britons who, one way or another, pushed back. So they became, living in the southern part of Scotland, Cornwall, and Wales, of course. So it's in some ways it's considered the birth of England. Although England and Britain, all these names are a little bit contentious, so we do have to be a bit careful.
You mentioned her father, Alfred the Great. And I was just surprised to hear you talk about how he wasn't necessarily known as the King of Wessex as we know today. So thank you for bringing that to our attention, because I don't know that many people know that.
Well, it was the land of the West Saxons. And again, we're not entirely sure where they came from. They seem to have originated with a tribe called it's difficult to pronounce, so I'll spell it. It's Gewisse. Maybe Gewisse would perhaps be the closest to it. But again, nobody's quite sure whether they were already here. It might have been one of the British kingdoms that then got sort of taken over by the Saxons who settled there. But Wessex is the general term. And I think certainly by the later period, it's perfectly okay to use that word, Wessex.
Now, I can't even say her name. Aethelflaed. Aethelflaed was born about 870. Would that be correct?
I think so. 869 or 870, yeah.
What do we know about her childhood? Is there much that's known about it?
Really, hardly anything at all. We have actually very little information about her, full stop, her whole life. The only thing we can say about her childhood is we know she was the eldest of Alfred the Great's surviving children. It seems that they had a lot of other children, which is a very, very poignant line. Alfred the Great had his biography written by a monk called Asser, who actually lived and wrote in Wessex during Alfred's lifetime. And he talks about the children and he puts them in birth order, but he also talks about a number of children who were either lost before or shortly after birth or in childhood. We can't see the number because it's not clear to read, but it's a touching moment that, there were clearly other children who didn't survive, and it was considered worthy of mention, which I think gives us some kind of idea about how valued children were in that period. But as to Aethelflaed's younger life, we don't know. Asser tells us that the younger children were, I think his exact words were, educated at all times at the royal court. And for some people, the inference therefore must be that the older children weren't. And we don't have any evidence where Aethelflaed grew up. If she hadn't grown up at the court, if she was maybe sent away for a period of time, the only likely place would have been Mercia, which was where her mother came from. And in fact, Alfred's sister was married to the King of Mercia. So there were already connections with the Mercian court. So it's possible that Aethelflaed spent her early years there, but it's a question of joining up some dots, which I think don't really make a straight line. The likelihood is that she grew up with the rest of her brothers and sisters at the royal court. Other than that, we really don't know a lot. We know that Alfred valued education, that his children were educated. But beyond that, no, we have no detail. And in fact, the main source of information for this period, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, they don't even mention in that Aethelflaed was actually Alfred's daughter. Later on, she's described as Edward's sister, Edward being Alfred's son who ruled after him. But there's actually very little information about her at all. So we kind of have to, as I say, fill in the gaps as plausibly as possible.
Really, we shouldn't be too surprised that there is a woman in history that we don't know a whole lot about.
Well, that's true.
It always seems to be the case, unfortunately. Well, I'm curious, Annie, as a child, or let's even say a young woman, what events in history did Aethelflaed experience? Well,
if she had been sent to Mercia for part of her childhood, it's possible that she would have witnessed the great army arriving in Repton in Mercia in 874, which actually caused her uncle, the king, to flee. He eventually went to Rome, where he died not long after. So she might have been witness to that. I suspect if she had been there, she would have been sent home quick smart back to Wessex, where it was deemed safer for her. In which case, just 4 years later, in 878, the Vikings attacked Alfred's hall and settlement at Chippenham in Wiltshire. And she might well have been there at the time. And it was after that attack that Alfred famously went and hid out in the marshes in Athelney, which is where, if we believe the story, the famous story about him burning the cakes was probably can be traced to that time. So those would have been 2 episodes that she might have been witness to. But that's all I can say. She might have. We really don't know, unfortunately.
Now, I'm not sure if you can answer this either, but would she have experienced stability in her childhood? Because it really seems like in that time of history that every day just brought a new threat with the Danes invading the continent and whatnot.
I think in terms of her personal life, I think probably a lot of stability. From the small amount of information we have, I think it was quite a close-knit family, and certainly in her later life, she worked very closely with her brother. But I suspect that her father was not around a great deal. I think all of the family and the children would have been very aware of this constant threat. You talked about the Bernard Cornwell books, and the whole series is called The Last Kingdom. And while it's not strictly true that Wessex was the only kingdom that was still free, it's true that it was the only kingdom that was completely free of the Vikings. And I think there must have been an awareness of that. Stability in terms of Alfred just constantly being away fighting. There is so much Viking activity during this period that I constantly have to refer to my notes if I want to remember any of it. I've just got a list here. I'll just give you a few examples. We have got in 865, the Great Heathen Army comes to East Anglia. In 867, it moves from East Anglia to Northumbria. It moves from Northumbria to Mercia and overwinters there. It goes back to York in 8689. It stays for a year. Then it goes back into East Anglia. So it's constantly on the move. It's not just one army. It's lots of different groups of different Vikings. In 871, the Great Heathen Army came to Wessex, and there was a battle, the Battle of Ashdown. So it's constant warfare, pretty much. And I think she would have been very, very much aware of that, even though she wouldn't have witnessed any of it necessarily, as I say, apart from possibly the attack in Chippenham in 878. But this constant awareness that, Daddy's away fighting the nasty people, I think, yes, there would have been huge fear, I think, particularly of what was an unseen enemy, which is, always heightens the fear, especially for a child.
And then she married as a teenager. She was like 16 or 17, right?
Well, we think so. Okay. We don't actually know when she was married. The assumption is that she married Aethelred, or I prefer to call him Aethelred. I know I'm going back on everything I said, but I'll call him Aethelred. Aethelred of Mercia was actually involved in the, difficult to say, the restoration, the taking back of London in 868. I'm saying we're not sure whether it was a taking back or a restoration, because it's not entirely clear whether the Vikings were still there at that point. They might actually have left or been pushed out a few years beforehand. But at that point, it's clear that London was back in English control. And we think that might be when Alfred decided it would be a good idea for his daughter to marry Aethelred of Mercia. And I think it's likely that it would have been Alfred's idea. Although I have read recently that Aethelred might have been wanting to bolster his own claims to ruling Mercia by marrying Aethelflaed, who of course was half Mercian. So it's interesting. We're not sure entirely the circumstances of the marriage, but it's likely that it took place around about that time. So yes, she would still have been a teenager at that point. And I think Aethelred would have been considerably older than her, not least for the fact that he wasn't a king, but he was ruling Mercia, and we don't have any suggestion that Alfred installed him as any kind of puppet, that he was already a leader of Mercia. So it stands to reason that he would have been a tried and tested warrior and some years older than his wife, we think.
This whole time period can be so confusing to so many of us who are used to.
Oh, definitely, yes. Although I find the Tudors very confusing, because it seems to me they were all called Thomas. But
yes, they were Thomas or Henry or. Yes. Yeah.
This brief interruption is brought to you by, well, me. Do you love Tudors Dynasty? Consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Patrons get access to all kinds of amazing things that the everyday listener does not. Find out more by going to Patreon, that's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty, and click Become a Patron for details. All right, back to the show.
Well, okay, so we talked about Aethelflaed and Aethelred, and their long reign. I mean, maybe we kind of covered that in Mercia. But after Aethelred died, she kind of took over for him, didn't she?
She did. And in fact, there's quite a lot of evidence that she was ruling for some years before he died. It's very interesting that early on, there's a kind of a triumvirate of Alfred, his eldest son Edward, and Ethelred working together, fighting the Vikings. And Ethelred is named in the sources as being there at crucial points. One 10th century chronicler actually talks about Ethelred coming to Edward's aid at one point. And then all of a sudden, round about 902 to 904, he just disappears. He's last spotted in a charter dated for around about 904. In 902, it all kind of went wrong. Edward is king of Wessex by this time. Alfred died in 899. And one of the first things that Edward had to do was fight off a rebellion by his own cousin. So his claim to the throne wasn't as secure as he might have wished it. But the fighting that goes on around this time, there's no mention of Ethelred by name. And it's just like he completely disappears. There are a few key battles where you'd have expected him to be leading the Mercian forces, and he isn't. And we do have a source which is not entirely reliable, but it is full of detail. It's an Irish fragmentary source that talks about they call him King Ethelred, being diseased and on the point of death. So if we take these two things together, this Irish source that claims that he was ill and the fact that he kind of disappears from the record, it's safe to assume that from around about 902 onwards, he was somehow incapacitated. I'm thinking perhaps he might have had a stroke, which didn't kill him, but maybe left him unable to rule. And it does look like Aethelflaed was ruling in his stead even before his death in 911. So, that's rather interesting. What's also interesting is that when Ethelred died, Edward did not sweep in and take over Mercia. He was seemingly quite happy to let his sister rule there. I think the two of them were very close, and she obviously had some remarkable qualities because it's not usual. It's not completely unprecedented, but it's not usual for a woman to be leading a country or a kingdom at that time.
So it'd be safe to say she was a successful female ruler.
Oh, I think so. There's a curious part of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is basically where we get almost all of our information about her from. And it's a thing, it's known as the Mercian Register, and it's been included in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and it's clearly written by the Mercians. And it's not very long. It covers the years 902 to 918. And I actually did type it out at one point, and you can fit it all on an A4 sheet of paper. So there's really not a lot of detail, but it does talk about her reign, and it talks about her having the right to rule and the authority to rule. It doesn't talk about her fighting, but it does talk about the campaign against the Vikings, the towns that she managed to wrest back from Viking control. And it's a fascinating document. The thinking is that it might have been part of a longer document, but that's lost to us now. But clearly she was very successful. And clearly the Mercians had no problem with being led by a woman. And neither did her brother. It's possible that he was being spread too thinly. He'd had to put down a rebellion from his own cousin. There were lots and lots of Viking incursions. So he may literally have just been too busy and too thinly stretched to also take direct control of Mercia. But again, he let her. He didn't try to put somebody else in her place, which I think speaks volumes for not only their relationship, but her strength of character and her personal qualities.
We often see her as like a warrior queen. Is that a fair statement? Was she actually involved in any battles?
Well, there is, again, no direct evidence that she was. I don't think so, because firstly, the Mercian Register doesn't say it. We do have other sources which place her at battles, leading the troops. But again, the main one is the Irish Annal that I mentioned before, which is more written like a saga rather than a chronicle. So we have to be a little bit careful with that. Did she actually fight? Normally with this period, we look around for comparisons, other examples, and we can say, well, we don't know that this person did that, but we do know that this was the habit, this was the custom. With Aethelflaed, we can't say, because with a few notable but very brief exceptions, we don't know of any other women who were in her situation. There was a woman called Athelborough who apparently burnt a town to the ground, but that is literally all we know about that. If she fought, I'm wondering, where did she learn to do that? We know that the royal children at Alfred's court had an education, but there's certainly no mention of the daughters being taught, how to wield a sword. Maybe her husband taught her to fight. That's a possibility. My guess would be that she was a figurehead. The Mercian Register talks about her sending an army into Wales. It talks about her obtaining Derby, which was one of the key strategic towns that they managed to get back from the Vikings. But it doesn't actually say that she was there at the front fighting. I'm not sure she would have been, but we can't say either way. We have no evidence one way or the other, unfortunately.
Do we know when this idea of her being a warrior queen, so to speak, started?
It's really interesting, actually, because I've recently written a book about women of power in Anglo-Saxon England, and what struck me was that the contemporary chronicles, if they say anything at all about the women, they tend to be very matter of fact. Like Queen Ethelborough, they just say, oh, she burnt a town to the ground. Okay, move on. That you don't need any more detail. What we do find is that slightly later, the Anglo-Norman chroniclers give lots more detail, and a lot of it is quite derogatory. So we get lots of accusations of witchcraft and murder and, poison and this kind of thing. But they seem to love Aethelflaed. And Henry of Huntingdon actually wrote a poem comparing her to Caesar. Heroic, he called her. So I think some of it started then. There was a huge resurgence of interest in the Anglo-Saxon period during the Victorian era, which I think might also have had something to do with this idea of her being, the warrior queen.
That sounds about right with the Victorians.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it is unusual in that, as I say, most of the 12th century chroniclers weren't that fond of the Anglo-Saxon women, particularly a lot of the religious women, interestingly. But Henry of Huntingdon absolutely fell in love with Aethelflaed and wrote a poem about her, which, it's that may have been when it started.
That's interesting. Now, she died. She wasn't even 50 yet, was she? I mean, if we have a rough idea of when she was born.
Yeah, I certainly, maybe 48, 49. What we don't know really is whether that was an especially old age. There's lots of examples of people living that long, going way back into Mercian history. Penda, who was famously the last pagan king of Mercia, if we can work his dates out properly, he was in his 50s and still fighting. So it's not unheard of. What we don't know is things like puberty and menopause. We don't know whether these ages have changed significantly over the years. But I think it's fair to say, after the life she led, by the time she was getting towards her 50s, I think she'd have been very tired. She spent a lot of her time, if not physically fighting, then the whole campaign of building towns, these fortified towns known as boroughs, which was very important in her joint campaign with her brother. So I think she lived to a good age. what we've got to bear in mind is that in the Anglo-Saxon period, they suffered periods of extreme drought, of famine, but of course that would have affected the ordinary people much more than the nobility. The nobility and the religious people had the best diets. So whether 50 is a good age or not, I don't know. There are certainly examples of women of her class living to even older. So it's probably not that unusual.
Do we have any idea of what her cause of death was?
No, we don't. And she does seem to have been fully active up to the point where she died. She died in Tamworth, which was another town that she'd reclaimed from the Vikings. At that point, various sources tell us, again, we have to look mainly to this Irish source, that she was also campaigning separately from her brother against the Viking Norse, and that she was involved in a battle at Corbridge up in, well, I suppose it's now Northumberland, quite a long way away. If we put all the sources together, she would have been travelling hundreds and hundreds of miles during her final few months. The people of York had come to her in the year that she died, asking for her help against the Vikings in York. So it sounds like a woman in her absolute prime. The campaign is very, very successful, and then suddenly she dies. I have heard a theory that she might have been murdered because she needed to be got out of the way. I don't give it much credence. There's certainly no suggestion. And I think the Mercian Register, which is clearly written in Mercia by Mercians in support of her, I think they possibly would have mentioned if there was any suspicion of foul play. So I don't know. But she clearly didn't have a long lingering illness. She was very, very active up until the point that she died. But what I have noticed is that very rarely do we get told what people die of. They don't seem to even link up terribly much the fact that people die shortly after being in battle, and we assume that they might have died of battle wounds, but it's not often mentioned unless somebody is assassinated. So, it's not information that we get given a lot of, unfortunately.
It's fascinating. I've never heard the theory that she may have been murdered and to have somebody take her place. Who would they have thought to take her place? Because she had a daughter, did she not?
She did have a daughter. Again, we don't know when Elfwin was born. She was with her mother, interestingly, in 915, so only 3 years before her mother died. We have her name. She witnessed a charter which was issued at a place called Weirdborough. We don't know where that place is, but it was another town that Aethelflaed was building, a fortified town, a fortified borough. And her daughter, Alfwin, was clearly there with her. So the likelihood is she was probably not a tiny child, because I don't think Aethelflaed would have taken a tiny child on campaign with her. Possibly she was a teenager by then. I suspect that Alfwin would have been born certainly before, say, 902, when we can be sure that her father was fairly ill. So she was possibly a teenager, possibly being groomed to learn how to take over the reins. But then we don't know that Aethelflaed thought that she'd be dead within 3 years. There is a possibility that Athelstan, her nephew, who eventually did become King of England, was also fighting on campaign with her. But there's no suggestion that Aethelflaed ever considered him her heir. And the Mercians were quite happy for Alfwin to take over from her mother. But Edward of Wessex had other ideas, unfortunately. So this murder theory, I mean, it's not something that's supported by any of the contemporary or even later sources. I think this is a modern idea that she might have been murdered, but by whom, I don't know. The West Saxons, the Vikings, plenty of people would have perhaps thought they might benefit from her death. But then again, I think she would have been very closely guarded as well. So it's not a theory I subscribe to anyway.
It's an interesting theory, and I think a lot of people are going to be a lot more interested in learning about her now that they know that little possible tidbit. But the one thing that I'm very intrigued by is that Aethelflaed seems to have been a very successful female ruler. But in the 12th century, we had Empress Matilda, who, for some reason,
the men around her did not want her to be queen. Why? What do you think changed in the culture of the country between that time?
In a word, 1066. I think a lot of, I think a huge line actually is drawn through history at that point, because although the Normans were technically descended from the Vikings, it seems that by that stage they, if anything, were slightly more, what's the word, maybe Frenchified, seem to have lost touch a little bit with their Viking origins. Their customs, their societal expectations, their culture was very, very different. They spoke a different language. And I said at the beginning that we don't know exactly the nature of the settlement of the Angles and the Saxons. We do know the nature of the Norman conquest, which was that essentially the whole top tier of English society was removed. And I think there was a different attitude to women. I know a lot about the Anglo-Saxon attitude to women. I know less about the Norman attitude, but it seems to me that a lot of the freedoms that the Anglo-Saxon women had were not necessarily afforded to the Norman women. And I think attitudes changed. And certainly by the time of Empress Matilda, I believe she liked to be called, again, 12th century attitudes were still, I mean, history is still being written by the churchmen. You know, it was the monks who were the scribes, and attitudes were changing towards women. I think there was more emphasis on the idea of, you know, women being, you know, the original sinners. And I think the Norman culture generally was perhaps less tolerant of powerful women. That would be my take on it.
I find it interesting that Matilda's father named her as his heir instead of Stephen. And then we move forward to Henry VIII, who was so desperate to have a male heir. I just see the country regressing so much over that time.
Yes, I mean, poor Matilda. I mean, she fought and fought and fought, and ultimately got nowhere. So yes, it's really interesting, and I think, I mean, possibly that was, you know, it was certainly the last attempt, wasn't it, before the Tudors for a woman to rule. It may be that I think by then England was probably so entrenched with the idea that men do the ruling. So poor Henry, yes, well, poor Henry. I have no sympathy for him at all, I'm afraid. But yeah, desperate for a male heir, because that was the important thing. You know, you had to carry on your line through the males.
What do you think was Aethelflaed's greatest contribution to history?
I mean, for me, she's someone that gets us talking about the Anglo-Saxons, which is a great thing. She was instrumental in the fight to push back the Viking advance. There's no doubt about that. You know, you've got a brother and sister working in accord, and the borough building campaign was actually not at all random. It was very strategic. She was building boroughs which allowed Edward free time to go off fight the Vikings in one area, and then he would build them that allowed her troops to go off and fight in another area. We know from this and from the Mercian Register that there was a point in history where people had no problem, no issue whatsoever with a woman being in charge. And I think that's great. It hasn't happened very often, but at least we know it did happen. We shouldn't get hung up on her title. She wasn't a queen, but then the word queen is a bit problematic those times, because the Anglo-Saxons didn't use it in the same way that we consider it. She was the lady of the Mercians, and to be the lady is quite a title. The other great thing, I think, which is, again, it didn't last, it wasn't successful, but she was a woman ruler who was succeeded by a woman ruler. And that didn't happen again until we get to the Tudors. And it's often overlooked, partly because shortly after Aethelflaed died, her daughter did succeed her. She was, you know, sort of elected leader by the Mercians, and Edward of Wessex this time decided that he would take Mercia under his direct control. We don't know what happened to Alfwyn. The likelihood is that she ended up in a nunnery somewhere. And I suspect that part of the reason was that Edward was more secure in his own kingdom. They'd pushed back the Vikings. He also had adult sons by this stage, which he didn't when Aethelred of Mercia died. So I think all of those factors combined for Edward to say, leave well alone, I'll leave my sister there. But I think the fact that he didn't allow her daughter to carry on ruling speaks to me absolute volumes about Aethelflaed's personal qualities, and whether she actually wielded a sword or whether she didn't. If we piece the information together, what we get is a picture of this incredibly strong, incredibly capable woman who was clearly loved, clearly supported by all the men and family around her. And I think she's just a shining example, really, of what was achieved in such turbulent times. And I think that's a very important message to get across. And the fact that, it wasn't all men doing the fighting and doing the ruling. So I think that's probably her contribution. The fact that we talk about her so much, even though we really know so little about her. Something has stuck, something strikes a chord. There's definitely something resonating there.
Maybe a little women's empowerment.
I think so. Yeah. And I love the idea. I mean, the Mercian Register was very, very offended and outraged by Alfwyn's removal, and it talks about her being deprived of all authority. So clearly at this time, and we have to assume that this Mercian Register was also written by monks. At this period, they had no problem with women ruling. They were outraged that this woman had been, deprived of her authority. So yeah, definitely a small moment of girl power.
So if you'd love to know more about Aethelflaed and other women of power in Anglo-Saxon England, please do check out Annie's books. I will have links in the show notes on tudorsdynastypodcast.com. Annie, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Thank you for letting me talk and waffle on about my favourite subject. It's been a joy. Thank you.
And that concludes this episode of the podcast. A special thank you to our newest patrons, Leslie P., Samantha T., and Jenna C. Up next on Ask the Expert, the dissolution of the monasteries. We'll answer all those burning questions you've had about the events and the people involved in the destruction of those gorgeous buildings. Thank you so much for listening. And Jack, put on your pants.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Tudors Dynasty Podcast. You can follow and support the Tudors Dynasty Podcast on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon @Tudors Dynasty.